So let's just give an introduction. This talk is about responsibility and growth through responsibility. And for me, responsibility is probably one of the most, if not the most important ingredient in living life. Okay? If you just think about how we go about our daily affairs, right? If you want to be successful, the chances are much better if you live a responsible life than if you do not live a responsible life, right? You're irresponsible. And therefore, it is really a basic idea that man has to live by, this idea. And again, it really has a lot to do with the person. As you know, it can affect another person. It can affect our relationship with, a spouse, a boss, a child, right? It can also affect our relationship with God, okay? And that's what we want to talk about today, our responsibility to ourselves and what that is as far as, the relationship of God. How does it play out for God? So let me first say that in Judaism, responsibility shows up in really central areas of Judaism. Being the chosen people. What does that mean? We are chosen, right, amongst the nations, right? I think the simple shot is, it's obviously not that we're better than the people, right? It's not that we are smarter than the people around the world. There are plenty smart people in the world. There are plenty dumb people in the world as well. Plenty of dumb Jews in the world as well. In Israel, we got tons of them, right? So really, being chosen has to do with a certain responsibility we have to the world. So something as central as the idea of being a chosen nation includes responsibility. That's the basic idea. I am chosen by God to do something for a certain mission. We, the Jewish people, are chosen for a certain mission, and I have to be responsible to that mission. In halacha, you have a basic idea, which sort of comes into Rabbi Manning's shiur as well, is Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lo Zeh. I am responsible for every Jew, and actually, it changes halacha, meaning it has an effect on the fact that I can make kiddush for somebody else. I'm going to soon be able to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah for somebody else, even though I fulfilled the mitzvah. Because since somebody else did not fulfill the mitzvah, I am a guarantor for that person. What does an orev mean? It means I'm a guarantor, right? And because I'm a guarantor, I'm responsible for that person. When somebody takes out a loan in Israel, let's say, and you sign as an orev, I don't tell you to do that, but if you do sign as an orev, it really means, right, I'm a guarantor, which means I take responsibility. If he can't pay, I have to pay, right? I had signed on a certain loan for one of my kids, and they couldn't pay. And the lawyer called me up, and he said, your kid hasn't been sending in his mortgage payments, right? And you signed as an orev. And I said, you're right. I'm responsible to do that. I'm going to pick up the tab. So he said, he was in shock. The phone went silent. He said, it was silent. Then he said, I don't even have to argue with you. Your guarantor means that I can help you fulfill your mitzvah, right? Any mitzvah that you have, right? I can do that, even though I already fulfilled the mitzvah. Obviously, if you didn't fulfill the mitzvah, but if you fulfill the mitzvah, I could still do that for you. That's an unbelievable idea, a basic idea in Judaism, right? That we are so responsible for each other that the halacha gives us the right to help the other person fulfill the obligation. Reward and punishment. The bottom line for reward and punishment is responsibility. If I don't need to be responsible, there's no concept of reward and punishment. It's because God demands you be responsible for your actions, right? So these are, and reward and punishment is like a basic tenet in Judaism, right? And I'm going to claim that Yom Kippur, one of the central themes of Yom Kippur, is also is responsibility. But we'll see that soon. Taking responsibility is not so easy. Okay? And that's why people like to shirk responsibility, right? And I think in our world today, we don't work hard enough to, let's say, give our children responsibility, right? We spoil them. Really, there should be, I think there's a book on it actually, Teaching Children Responsibility, which means that people are not doing it. That's why you need books on it, obviously, right? And let's say marriage, right? How could you have a good marriage without being responsible? Responsible on the one hand for certain things you come into marriage having to do, both spouses, and then of course part of responsibility is taking responsibility for the failures. If I haven't lived up to it, and a lot of people today don't want to get married, in the Western world. And part of the reason, maybe even an important part of the reason, is I don't want the responsibility. I don't want the responsibility of my wife or husband. I don't want the responsibility of kids, right? Because that is a huge responsibility. If you want to be successful, you have to have that. Okay? So, it's not very easy. And the proof that it's not very easy is our first source. I don't even know if you have to go beyond that tonight. The first source is Vayomer. After Adam and Eve sin, right? Vayomer, mi gidlecha ki arom ata. Who told you that you're naked, that you're not, you need to be, to get dressed? Hamila eitz asher tzivisicha levilti achol mimenu achalta? Did you eat from the tree I told you not to eat from? Vayomer ha'adam ha'isha shenasati imadi hi natnali min ha'etz v'ochel. What the first thing that Adam says, right, the first time Adam talks is basically, it's not my fault, it's my wife's fault. That's it, right? When someone doesn't take responsibility, what does that usually mean? I blame somebody else, right? And then, turns to Eve. Vayomer Hashem Elokim la'isha mazot asita. He believes Adam, right? And what does she say? Vatomer isha nachash. The snake enticed me, right? So we see that it has to be a basic nature of a human being, right? That he cannot take responsibility. That it's difficult for him to take responsibility. It's difficult for him to admit that he failed. And of course, when you take responsibility, sometimes you're successful, sometimes you have to admit that you failed. That's part of responsibility. And of course we see that Adam and Eve, right, shirked that responsibility. Okay? And if you think about it, there's an obvious question. Where did they learn this idea that you're supposed to blame somebody else? If there was nobody else around. Where did they learn it? Did somebody give them a lesson after they ate from the tree? Said, listen, you guys have to realize that you're in trouble. So you got to blame somebody else. That's the important thing. I understand that. We learn those things, that you always blame somebody else, right? And in so many cases, it's terrible because people cannot really be successful by putting blame on somebody else, right? We'll see other ramifications of putting the blame on other people tonight, but it seems that since nobody taught Adam and Eve, it's very natural, right? It's probably the most natural thing because nobody taught them and they knew about it, that you can blame somebody else, right? That Adam doesn't have to take responsibility for his actions and Eve doesn't have to take responsibility. They can blame somebody else. So since it's the basic nature of man, and I feel that probably for the rest of history, we're trying to be metaken, that sin, right? By taking responsibility, by showing man can take responsibility. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in one of his, on the Parsha, quotes a study where he found and this is a quote, in other words, this part of the study, exceptional gifted people found one thing particularly difficult, namely admitting that they made a mistake. He found that people that are especially very bright have a hard time saying, I made a mistake, right? And saying I made a mistake is extremely mature. It has to do with personal growth, right? And it's great in so many places. Okay, some people are afraid to say it because what will the boss say? What will my dad say? Right? But the truth of the matter is that people who are willing to say I made a mistake are also willing to learn. Okay? They're getting rid of that ego and they're willing to learn. I just want to point it out with a recent article I read. The article is called The Escape from Responsibility. I hate to bring in politics. I shouldn't say that. I love to bring in politics, right? And we'll keep it to a minimal, I hope, right? And in the article, written by David Ben-Basat, he says like this: when asked to explain the intelligence failure, Haliva, who was the head of Army Intelligence, we're talking about October 7th, right? He chose to describe Israel as a brothel. A betzonot, okay? It is difficult to imagine a word more damaging to national legitimacy and public trust. This is not just tactless. It casts a heavy stain on the character of a senior officer, a leader of the Israeli army, the leader of, right? He's basically the Shin Bet of the Israeli army. Shin Bet is a separate organization, but he's basically the head of intelligence of the army. The Israeli public expected to hear, and that's why this is important. It's less important because of the politics, more important about the language he uses here, the author of the article. The Israeli public expected to hear different words: taking responsibility, admitting failure. There's no question that there was a failure here. So what did he go? He blamed the country. He said, the country is just a betzonot. It's hefker. Things are hefker in the country. People didn't even know exactly what he meant when he used it. Taking responsibility, admitting failure, committing to correction. When I admit failure, I'm saying there should be correction. Instead, it received a sentence symbolizing loss of control, disrespect for the state and its institutions, and a willingness to remove personal responsibility and place it on the entire system. Okay? Now, we saw that with many other heads, right? The defense minister, the head of the army, Herzi Halevi, right? We saw it at a Shabbat bar. But what was amazing about it is we couldn't get them to resign. Right? I actually saw an interview, 2 interviews actually, at different times. One with Ariel Sharon's son, and the other with the head of Shabak at the time of Gush Katif. Okay? And separate interviews I saw. And I detected in both of them very clearly that they couldn't say Ariel Sharon made a mistake. The son couldn't say that, right? And Avi Dichter couldn't say it. And they asked him really difficult questions that they couldn't answer. So Avi Dichter chose to look embarrassed, but deny it. And the son of Ariel Sharon chose to be angry for them to asking them questions. He said, I'll never come back here again. Okay? Both of them, right, could not see that Ariel Sharon had to take responsibility for it. I mean, he's not alive, but it was a failure, and they could not admit it. Okay? Something that's extremely distressful in living in this country. Because if you can't admit you're wrong, you can't make it right. We've had other leaders, right? Golda Meir. She resigned right away after the Yom Kippur War. And she said why she's resigned. She said, I was a failure. I made a big mistake. Menachem Begin took responsibility for Sabra and Shatila in 1982. Shalom HaGalil. And he wasn't even involved in it. Ariel Sharon was involved. There are even books written that he wasn't even told about it. But since he was a head of state, he felt he has to resign because of what happened in Sabra Shatila. So great leaders understand that they need to take responsibility. And you could be a very high-level officer and be a midget as far as a leader is concerned. That's what we really saw. It was very shocking to me because it was a crazy, straight across the board. And Bar, you couldn't get him out of there. Now you couldn't get him resigned. Even today, we don't have a new head of Shabbat. We have something called the A. He's A because they don't want to tell you who he is yet because he's not yet is. I mean, it's absurd, right? But it tells you how difficult it is for, like Rabbi Sachs said, quoted, how difficult for someone very high up to say, I made a mistake, right? And this was a doozy, okay? He made a really big mistake. And that's what he's saying over here. The episode became a symbol of a corrupt organizational culture where responsibility evaporates and truth is replaced by denials and brazen statements. Exactly Adam and Eve, right? I deny it. It's not my fault. Still, a senior officer is held to a different standard of responsibility. Okay? When he chooses to use such words, he not only disgraces himself, but the entire state. There is no courage in this, only weakness. There is no truth in it, only admission of failure. In denying that it's his problem, he admitted failure, basically. That's what the author here says. That's one of the most difficult challenges we have, is taking responsibility in important matters, right, in our lives, right, whether it's to the job that we have, to the spouse that we have, to the child that we have, right? That's a major challenge. The stories I heard about Gedolei Torah, right? I'll tell you two stories where you see clearly how important they thought is taking responsibility. In other words, how important it is to, when you take responsibility, you have to really be responsible. Okay? You can't just say something and not take the responsibility for what you said. I want to share with you a story about Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer. He was this famous student of Rabbi Shlomo Salan. Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer was asked by somebody whether the person should make Aliyah. You're talking in the late 1800s, okay? And his question to that person was, can you make a living in Israel? That was his question. And the person told him how he thinks he's going to make a living. So he says, I can't really tell you to go to Eretz Yisrael. You can't say Aliyah, there was no state of Israel at that time, but to go to Eretz Yisrael. I can't really tell you to do that. So he says, why not? He says, I'm not sure you'll be able to make a living. Oh, okay, but, so that's why you can't tell me to make Aliyah. He says, yeah, because if I tell you to make Aliyah and you don't make a living, I have to send you that money every month. Listen to that. I take responsibility. I got to make sure that you have parnasa because I told you to go. That's taking responsibility. Okay? So he says, I can't take responsibility. I knew a fellow from a yeshiva, I'm not going to say what yeshiva, where they told him not to go to college. Okay? And he was a good learner and everything. And then he became a rebbe in a yeshiva, and he was not successful. And he told me, in America, I have real big ta'anot on the Rosh Yeshiva that told me to do that, because now he's not going to pay my salary. I have where to live. My wife's a teacher. I don't have enough money to live on. If I go back to him, if I say to him, you told me not to go to college, now what should I do? What do you think he's going to say? Well, I thought, that. That's not responsibility. Responsibility is when you tell somebody to do something, you're there for them. Maybe I'll just quote for you or not quote, but tell you a story how in number 3, the Gemara says, I'm not going to go into in what context the Gemara says, but the Gemara says a rule, Ein Adam roeh chova la'atzmo. A person never sees the mistakes he makes. Chova means that he's obligated, but it means like the mistakes that they made. A person can't see it because he's too concerned about himself. He has Adam koravitz la'atzmo. A person has he has a self agenda, right? He has to be right, so he can't see the wrong, right? Because he's got the ego. And the story is, very interesting story that it's brought out, with the Shach, Shapell Cohen, who was the famous author of the Shach on Shulchan Aruch, Yoredeya, Choshe Mishpat, right? And the Shach is really top of the line. In other words, in many, if not most of the cases, we paskin like the Shach. And whether it's Hilchos Kashrus or Dinei Momanus, like, taking people to the Torah for a monetary problem. So he had that. The Shach lived in Vilna. Of course, he was very famous because of his commentary he wrote on Shulchan Aruch. You talk about in the 1600s, these were the first commentaries on Rabbi Yosef Cairo and the Ramah, right? So what happened? A fellow had a din Torah with him. So he says, okay, we'll go to a din Torah, we'll see the Dayanim in Vilna. He said, not so fast. Not so fast. The Dayanim know you very well, and they don't know me. And they're going to be a little bit afraid of you. You're a tremendous Talmud Chacham, right? So I don't think we can go to the Dayanim in Vilna. And the Shach said, you're correct. Where would you like to go? He said, I want to go to the Rav in Nevardik. You could check up in the city of Nevardik. He's a very big Talmud Chacham. And the Shach checked up and found that he was a very big Talmud Chacham. He says, okay, he doesn't know me, we'll go there. And they go there for the Din Torah. Okay? And each one makes his claims. The Rav thinks about it a little bit. He says, come back the next day. They come back the next day and he says, the Balabayit is right, and sir, you're wrong. He says to the Shach, you're wrong. And the Shach is in shock. I mean, who knows Shulchan Aruch better than Reb Shapell Cohen, right? He wrote the commentary, so to speak, right? So he says to the person, I accept the psak halacha. I accept that I'm wrong and I have to pay, but I'd like you to tell me how you knew it. Where did you get it from in Shulchan Aruch? So he says, at first I thought you were right, but then when I had the day, I was learning through the subject, and there was a new sefer that came out. It's called the Shach on Shulchan Aruch. And I saw in there that according to what he writes, you're wrong. And the Shach right away called out, Kame gedola divrei chachomim shamru ein adam roeh chova la'atzmo. Right? People don't see. It's hard for a person to see. Well, I have my money at stake here. Right? You're never wrong when you have your money at stake. I've gotten phone calls from many of my alumni about rents and different things. And I'm amazed when they tell me what the question is, and I can't understand how it could be a question. Isn't it obvious? But it's not obvious because it's my money. So it's not obvious anymore. Right? And they can't see, but I laugh about it on the phone because it is so obvious. Right? But you can't see it. Ein adam roeh chova la'atzmo. Person doesn't see that. Right? And that's the problem. That's the problem when you have a leader, right, who refuses to see that he's wrong, right? He can't deal with it, right? And therefore, he doesn't take responsibility. He pawns it off on somebody else. So let's get to Yom Kippur. Okay? Yom Kippur, I believe, one of the central themes of Yom Kippur is responsibility. Where do you see that? Right? Where do you see that Yom Kippur has to do with responsibility? And I believe Yom Kippur has to do with tshuva. But we all have the same question. When we open up the Machzor, we never see it says, get rid of your sin, take upon yourself never to do the sin again, right? Have charata that you did the sin, right? Remorse, right? The only thing we see on Yom Kippur is what? Vidui. We doing it 7 times the whole day. I mean, at night, in the day, you're like, can't believe how many times you're doing it. You might as well just keep your hand on your heart the whole day, because you're just constantly doing that, right? Banging the heart, right? What is vidui? Vidui is confessing that I did the sin. I didn't say yet that I'm going to leave the sin. I didn't say yet I'm going to take it upon myself. I didn't even say I'm remorse. I just say, I confess I did a sin. What does that really mean? Right? Why is that the part of tshuva that the Anshe Knesset Gedola, the people who wrote the Siddur, why was that so important that they took it, right? The confession. It seems like it would be so much more important to say I'm never going to do the sin again, right? To leave it, I'm never going to do it again. That seems more important. But I believe that the basic, right, and first step to tshuva is admitting that I did something wrong. Because we can live our lives in denial, right? And we can blame everybody else. And take a look what Rabbi Sachs writes in his introduction to the Machzor of the Koren Machzor. Judaism is the world's greatest example of a guilt and repentance culture as opposed to the shame and honor culture of the ancient Greeks. A guilt culture is a culture of responsibility. We do not blame anyone else for the wrong we do. It's always tempting to blame others. Okay? It wasn't me. It was my parents. That's the famous thing. Get ready, guys. You're young. But get ready for your kids to blame you about everything. Okay? There's actually a comedian that talks about this whole thing. It's very, very funny. He says, get ready. Your kid is going to be 45 years old, laying on a couch and saying, it's all my dad's fault. Okay? It was my parents, my upbringing, my friends, my genes, my social class, the media, the system, them. Okay? That was the first 2 humans. That is what the first 2 humans did in the Garden of Eden. Right? That's what Adam and Eve did, right? When challenged by God for eating the forbidden fruit, the man blamed the woman blamed the serpent. The result was paradise lost. Blaming others for our feelings is as old as humanity, but it is disastrous. It means that we define ourselves as victims. I am a victim. It's not my fault. It's the fault of my parents, society, right? Fault of my teacher, right? I'm a victim, right? And in our society, we love to be victims. Not to take any responsibility. And unfortunately, that's almost today a value in our society. I can't be responsible. I can't, This is the way I was created. A culture of victimhood wins the compassion of others, as we know from Hamas made themselves into victims, and they got such compassion for it. But at too high a cost. It incubates feelings of resentment, humiliation, grievance, and grudge. It leads people to rage against the world instead of taking steps to mend it. All of anti-Semitism has to do with shirking your responsibility and finding the scapegoat, who happened to be the Jews, because they were weak. That's what it has to do with. Things weren't going well in Western Europe. Things weren't going well in Germany. You have an option. What you can do is think, how can I improve those? What mistakes did I make? Or you can blame somebody else. And of course, that's exactly what they did. It leads people to rage against the world instead of taking steps to mend it. Jews have suffered much, but Yom Kippur prevents us from ever defining ourselves as victims. As we confess our sins, we blame no one else but ourselves. And that's the most important thing. Take the responsibility. When I say, Al chet shechatanu lifanecha, right? That lifanecha is probably more important than the Al chet shechatanu. Lifanecha means I take responsibility because God is standing here. I take responsibility because God saw it. I am saying to God, you saw me do it. I can't hide it. Because I'd love to hide it. Right? I'd love nobody to know about it. But you can't hide it from lifanecha. That's why you don't say al chet shechatanu X, Y, and Z. Al chet shechatanu lifanecha. I did it in front of you. I'm going to admit it right now. Yom Kippur is about the idea of, a central idea, of taking the first step to tshuva. First step to tshuva is admitting that I sinned. Rav Soloveitchik talks about this issue, and I don't remember where the article is, but Rav Soloveitchik says that when a person does vidui, right, he's basically saying, I can change. When he sins, he's basically saying, I can change, I can repair what I've done wrong, right? And I could grow from what I've done. Why, he says? Because if I could admit I've done something wrong, then that means I have a free will to change. Because if I don't have free will, I haven't done anything wrong. Because what did I do wrong? I couldn't have done otherwise. Right? So the minute I say that, you know what, al chet shechatanu lifanecha, and by the way, chatanu was very important, that we sin. Because it's much easier if you have a lot of people with you doing the same thing. It's hard to tell the boss that I sin. But if the whole company sinned, we'll all go together. He may not stare at me, right? He may look at everybody else, right? It's much easier for me to say chatanu than chatati, right? So God is making it easy on you. He's saying, there's everybody here. We all have this sin and that sin and that sin, right? But Soloveitchik says, yes, when I admit that I've done wrong, that's really saying I can do right. That Rav Soloveitchik says actually on this week's parsha, he talks about it. And he says that the person, when he brings Bikurim, he says, right, when he's varer the maisrot that he has to do after a certain amount of time, you have to get rid of your maisrot, the person says, I was makayim your mitzvah. Right? And the commentaries call that halachically vidui maisrot, confession of maisrot. So Rav Soloveitchik says, you're confessing you did a mitzvah? We don't confess we did mitzvah, we confess we do aveiros. He says, no, you have to confess you do a mitzvah too. Because that tells you that you have free will. And therefore now when I do an aveira, right, I can confess that and say, you know what? I can change, God. I admit I did something wrong, but I can change. I can write it. Okay? Yom Kippur has to be the time when the day sort of sparks us to wake up to this. That we have to, face ourselves and face God, right? And tell God we weren't as good as we could be. Right? That's the important thing about Yom Kippur. Right? And sometimes you need, something to jar your memory. Because we repress those things. Something you need to jar your memory. I just want to give you one example of it, is the brothers and Yosef. They sold Yosef, and for years, it was Yosef's fault. It wasn't their fault. For years. You don't find that anyone during that time, there's any stories of the great regret that they had. But all of a sudden, something happens. Number 5. V'sachem hakaton tuviu elai v'yamnu divreihem v'lo tamutu v'yasu kein. In other words, Yosef says, bring me Binyamin. If you say you're not spies, bring me Binyamin because you say you have a brother. Vayomer yishol achiv, avol hashemem anachnu al achinu asher re'inu tzaras nafsho, bitchanenu eleinu v'lo shamanu Al kain bo eleinu atzara azot. All of a sudden they got the trigger. What triggered them to say, you know what? We now realize we made a mistake with Yosef. Okay? We didn't listen to him. He begged us, right? And now we're finally taking responsibility for it. Right? That's what's really important. Yom Kippur is supposed to spark in us to open ourselves up, think about what we've been doing this year, and face it. Being able to face what we did and say to God aloud, right? I take responsibility. I take responsibility for my life, not only as a human being, but as a Jew. Every person has to take responsibility, whether even an atheist has to take responsibility. But as a Jew, we have the great responsibility both to the rest of the world and, of course, to ourselves. I believe, right? Nobody really knows why we read Yonah at Mincha and Yom Kippur. Like, why do we read Yonah on Yom Kippur? What does that have to do with anything? Oh, so some people say because the people did tshuva. Come on. I need to know that the non-Jews did tshuva on Yom Kippur. That's really important to me. It's nice that non-Jews do your tshuva, don't get me wrong. You need to read Yonah because he shirks his responsibility. He runs away. Right? God gave him something he needed to do, to be responsible for. And he runs away. And God's telling him, Yonah, you can't run away from your responsibility. You always are responsible to me, and I'll make sure that you remain responsible to me. So even if you run away, right? Basically, that's the message, right? Eventually you have to face God. And I think that's really the reason why we read at Mincha, Yonah, at Mincha, because at that time of the day, right before Ne'ilah, right, the end of the day, so to speak, we want to let people know finally that we have that responsibility and you can't run away from it. You had that mission, we have that mission, Yonah had a mission, and he tried to escape the mission. He didn't want to do it, and God is saying to him, and that's the message that we get, is you can't do that. A Jew can't do it. Nobody could do it. We have a mission, we have a responsibility, and that's what we have to take along with us on the day of Yom Kippur. Thank you very much.